Melly. Can you hear me? Melly, can you hear me? I need you to give me a thumbs up. Somebody to tell me that you can hear what I'm saying. Can you hear me?
I hear you. You hear me?
I hear you loud and clear. Okay, good morning. Okay, I want to talk about the question you asked me yesterday because it's an important question. A very, very important question, actually. And I'll put it this way. When I'm finished answering your question, you'll still have your question because I'm not answering it. But I'm explaining it. In other words, I'm not going to prove anything to you. I'm simply going to make a presentation. I'm going to introduce you to an idea which will help you understand the concept, even if you feel that in reality you don't see this. Now that's what's going to happen. That's what I'm going to be doing now, okay? Your question basically was that I was discussing the idea that during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and of course according to this Maimer, the whole Tishrei, it's a special time, and Hashem is very close to us. And the way I explained it to you yesterday in class, an individual is like a whole minyan because there's a gili of Yod Gimel B'Des Harachmim and so on. And you said, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know what you're talking about. So I want to address this. Okay? And I'm going to start. Am I right? Did I say it correctly, Melly?
Yep.
Okay, so let me start from the beginning. And I guess we'll tie it into Yud Beis Tammuz if you want. The Rebbe was often asked, when you raise a Jewish child to be a Jew, right? What was the Soviets' complaint? What was the complaint of Stalin and Lenin and the myriads of Jews who got caught up in this fervor, this religious fervor of the socialist, communist movement that was so anti-God? And I want you to know that there's indications that in the end, in the 80s and in the 90s, the communists started to realize that there was absolutely no reason for them to persecute religion. You know, they wanted to make a new model of government based on socialism or communism. But why they had to attack religion? It's silly. It's just the way it played out in history because everything is from Klippa. What was the communist argument? The communist argument was, take a little child and you teach him about God, you teach him about creation. All of these ideas are very, very difficult for anybody, let alone for a child to be able to understand. And you're telling children really what amounts to the most profound ideas intellectually. God, creation, purpose. Children are at that young age in no position to critically think about these things and to process these things. So the argument was, it's brainwashing. Take a little child. Now, of course, the communists didn't not talk about God. They said there wasn't a God. In other words, they were allowed to brainwash the child. It's just the religious people who were not allowed to brainwash the child, okay? But the argument was, when you take a little child and you...
So you're agreeing that we're brainwashed.
Wait, Mel, let me do the talking. Give me some time. Let me do the talking. When I'm done, you'll be able to say all of these comments. This is the time. So their philosophy was like this: teach a child only things the child can understand. And again, they were allowed to brainwash their children that there isn't a God. That brainwashing was okay. But again, I don't want to go into the justice of it. We're just going to speak the theory. The taina was, you come to a little child and don't introduce the child to ideas that the child is unable to understand. Teach him simple things. When he becomes an adult and he has a critical ability to think critically, then you can introduce him to these profound ideas and let him decide for himself and so on. Now, what was the answer to this taina of the Rabbeim? And of course, in the times of the Friedrich Rebbe, it was in one style. But the Rebbe addressed this question many, many times in Yechidus and in other forums where people said the same question. You know, you're teaching little children things that don't give them a chance to critically process it, and they're not fully understanding it, ever. And frankly, I don't know if adults fully understand it, many adults at least, and they don't get a chance to choose it. So when the Rebbe was asked this question, the Rebbe gave an answer that a lot of people would say was evasive. It wasn't answering the question. The Rebbe's answer to the question is, when you teach a Jewish child about Yiddishkeit, the reason it's not brainwashing is because you're giving him something which is already his. That was the answer. This was a consistent interpretation. When people would ask the Rebbe many questions about many things, his answer would always be, you're not giving anybody anything, you're simply helping a person discover what they truly are. The Rebbe used to use this argument why it's not considered brainwashing to teach Jewish children about Hashem and about Torah, mitzvahs and so forth. And he would also use this argument when it came to Mivtzoyim. The Rebbe always said that when you meet a Jew on the street and you ask him to put on tefillin, you're not trying to change him. You're simply helping him discover what he truly is. This is a constant position in the Rebbe's idea, thinking. Okay, now I want to analyze this, or if I may dare say, I want to even try to see if I can prove to you that you'll agree with it. Okay. On the face of it, these arguments that when you teach a little child about God, it's not brainwashing because God's already his. When you're teaching an adult about tefillin, you're not trying to force him to do religious things he doesn't want to do because he's already his, are predicated on a very simple philosophy. That a Jew is a soul, a Jewish soul. And that the Jewish soul is inherently bound up in God. A Yid is a neshama. The neshama gives him an inherent relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when you're teaching a child about Hashem, or you're trying to get an adult who has not been raised with the spirit of Torah mitzvahs or with the law of Torah mitzvahs to adopt these things, you're not trying to change him, you're trying to actualize the promise, the prospect, the possibility that exists in his neshama. That's the shita. Or to say it in modern language, okay? I'm going to repeat myself now in a more modern form. What is the difference between the Lubavitch approach to Kiruv and the non-Chabad approach to Kiruv? And by the way, what I'm about to say may be simplistic. It may not be entirely true. It's certainly true to some extent. Okay? What is the difference between the Chabad approach to Kiruv and the non-Chabad approach to Kiruv? The answer is Chabad's approach to Kiruv is you talk to the soul, you don't talk to the mind. That's why it's a philosophical. It's a principle in Lubavitch to avoid arguments and to avoid debates. Shluchim are taught, don't become philosophical with people, because you're not going to get to his neshama through his brain. To the contrary, when you start talking to a person's mind, you're immediately talking to the person's ego. So it becomes an ego against an ego, it becomes a power struggle, it becomes an ego struggle, and you actually push the person further away. The approach to shlichus of shluchim that's worked unbelievably effectively is you avoid engaging in debate as much as you possibly could. You talk to the soul, and the soul responds. And there's so many stories. I have a story with a woman who I know, she's a student of mine, who lived in Louisiana. And she was doing her doctoral thesis, a smart kid. And her topic was, her professor was a Jewish guy, one of the most famous Jewish atheists in America. Her supposition was that Orthodox Judaism is dead since the Holocaust. There's no more Orthodox Judaism. which is, of course, so silly. So her professor said to her, I'm going to sponsor you, I'm going to help you, and you go out and do the research. So she called up every rabbi in New Orleans, and she said, I want to write a doctoral thesis, and I need to do research. Can I talk to you? And they said, sure. She called the Reform rabbis, she called the Reconstructionist rabbis, she called the Conservative, and of course then she called the Orthodox rabbis in Louisiana, New Orleans, and they all told her, no, why would we talk to you about the fact that Orthodoxy is dead in America? If Orthodoxy is dead in America, we don't exist. Then she called Rabbi Rifkin, and she said, I'm writing a doctoral thesis. The premise of the thesis is that Orthodox Judaism is dead since the Holocaust. Would you talk to me? She said, sure. Come on down. So she came down with a tape recorder and her knapsack and her yellow pad and her pencils and her erasers and her sharpeners. She sits down. He walks into the room. He sits down opposite her. And the conversation begins like this. Do you know how to light Shabbos candles? So she says to him, what's that? What is Shabbos candles? She had no idea what it was. So he says, good. He takes a scrap of paper, writes his address, home address, hands it to her and says to her, Friday afternoon at this time, come to my house. My wife will show you how to do it. And he walks out of the room, interview over. That was the end of the conversation. Anyway, she showed up on Friday. She lit candles, and now she's living in Crown Heights. She's a mother of 6 children, and she's wearing a sheitel. And apparently Orthodoxy isn't dead. This is a classic shliach's approach. We don't argue with people. In other words, we don't believe that the way to make a Jew more Jewish is through debate. There are schools of thought within the Kirum world, that prove things. And they prove a young earth, they prove the Torah is true. And of course there are Sfarim who are dedicated to this end, like the Kuzari specifically, that proves different things. But the approach of Lubavitch is, when you want to meet a Jew, and you want to get him to change, don't talk to his mind. Because there's so much convolution, it's so complicated. Talk to the soul. And again and again and again and again, it works. It works 1,000 times over. You talk to a Jewish soul, not always the first time, and the soul is awakened. Jewish people will do things that intellectually make no sense. The only explanation for it is because they have a Yiddish neshama. It's a fact. It's an undeniable fact. And there is, like I said to you before, innumerable examples of this phenomena, where you talk to a Jew and you're not talking to his mind, you're talking directly to his neshama. Okay? I'll tell you a story. Noch a Meise. Okay? I heard the story secondhand, not firsthand, but secondhand, but not thirdhand either. I heard it from the father of the shliach with whom this occurred. A shliach in California he was a chaplain on a military base. And he met a major general of the United States Army, a very smart man. In peacetime, to be a general in the United States Army, you have to be brilliant academically, who's African-American, he's black. And they were talking about his work as a chaplain. And in the course of the conversation, this African-American man said to this shliach, my great-grandmother was a Jew. My great-grandmother was a Jew. Really? How so? He said, well, my mother's mother was Jewish. In other words, a woman, married an African-American man, had a daughter who married an African-American man, who had a daughter who married an African-American man, and he's the son, which means he's Jewish. His fathers were black. His mother and his grandmother were what you would call a genetic mix, but he was halachically a Jew. So he says to this African-American major general of the United States Army, you should know you're as Jewish as Moses and as Abraham and as any Jew who ever lived. Of course, he was very surprised to hear this. He never thought for a moment that if your great-grandmother was a Jew, you're Jewish. And then the Chabad rabbi says to him, now that you discovered that you're Jewish, maybe you should do something Jewish. He says, what do you think I should do? He says, put on tefillin. He described to him what tefillin is, and he says, no, that's not for me. That's too invasive. It's too personal. I'll take off my jacket and roll up my beautifully starched shirt. His wife, who was actually African-American, says to her husband, the rabbi says, you're going to put on the tefillin, you're going to put the tefillin on. And we all know who's in charge. So this African-American major general takes off his coat, rolls up his sleeve. He found out that he's Jewish 2 minutes before. It's not like he had any history. He found out that he's a Jew 2 minutes earlier, makes a bracha on the tefillin, puts the tefillin on. Of course, he helps him. Shal Yad and Shal Rosh. He starts saying, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and he starts to cry uncontrollably. Again, I heard the story from the father of the shliach with whom the story happened. He starts to cry hysterically. And he realizes that this is asinine. This makes no sense. He was a smart guy. Why is he crying? He's doing his wife a favor and he's doing a Jewish act. Being Jewish has no meaning to him. He doesn't see himself as a Jew. So he turns to this shliach and he starts to scream at him. Why? What am I saying? Why am I crying? Meaning to say, he figured that there's some kind of a magic potion or a voodoo effect that he should, do a Jewish act, which has very, very, very little meaning to him, and he should be crying so hysterically. So, Meli, where are you? I need to ask you a question. How do you explain this story?
In your way and
No, in your way, not in my way, in your way.
Only possibility is because of your neshama.
That's the only way to explain it. It's a neshama. I'll tell you a story that happened to me. Okay, this is a story that happened to me. I used to go on Mitzvahs to 47th Street, which is the Diamond District. And I would meet Jews who were cutting stones on these they had these desks, these tall desks, they would sit and cut stones. And a lot of them were Israeli, we put film on them. There was an American family, a father and two sons, who had an office, a business, and they were buying and selling stones, and they were cutting stones. We went in every single Friday to them. They were very nice to us. We always gave them the thought for the week. They never wanted to put on film. And they were very respectful. But occasionally they would tell us, I want you to know, we don't believe in any of this. We're atheists, but we want to be nice people. So you want to offer me a piece of paper that I should read? I'll take it. Sometimes I'll read it. But you should know this is not our thing. This went on for maybe a year. And it was like a thorn in my throat. It just bothered me that they would say, if they had said it with anger, it wouldn't have bothered me as much. But he said it so coldly. He says, listen, I'm a Jew. You want to give me these paraphernalia, I'm happy to take it from you. But you should know this is not my thing. So one Friday I decided that I got to get to the bottom of this man. So I started asking him questions. I started asking, you don't believe in anything? No. He doesn't believe in marrying a Jewish. He doesn't believe in keeping kosher. Doesn't believe in keeping Shabbos. And everything I asked him, he said, no, it means nothing to me. And I was about to concede that, yeah, I met a Jew who really doesn't care. And then he made the terrible mistake of offering me the piece of information. He says, I fast Yom Kippur. I don't go to temple. I stay home, but I fast Yom Kippur. So I began to drive that. I said to him, why? Why do you fast Yom Kippur? And I pressed him, and I pressed him, and I pressed him. Now, what was the point? What was I trying to tell him? What I was trying to tell him is that his fasting Yom Kippur, he cannot explain rationally. And my point was that being Jewish is actually something from the neshama. It's actually something from the inside. Okay? And this is the philosophy of Chassidus. This is really what the Baal Shem Tov was all about. Baal Shem Tov came into the world at a very, very dark period of time, introduced a philosophy which says, when you talk to a Jew, don't talk to his mind, talk to his soul. This idea has never shown itself more acutely, more crisply, more extremely than in the post-Holocaust world. We have so many Jews who are so deeply assimilated, and yet you can get them to do a mitzvah, you can get them to come to shul, you can get them to wake up, and in some cases literally become Bailei Tshuva. Why? Not because it touched their mind, because it touched their soul. You follow? You understand what I'm saying, Millie? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So this is the foundation of it. The foundation of it is that, historians, social scientists, academics have to be able to explain everything. That's the premise, right? Why does Judaism have these practices? Well, you can go back to pagan practices, and you'll see that from these pagan practices, everything has to have a logical explanation. And if you go back far enough, you'll learn that we used to be like chimpanzees, and we used to see waterfalls, and it used to make us very excited, and we used to do a water dance. That's the earliest form of religion. My conclusion to all of those anthropological approaches is blah, 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 blah. So the entire premise of the secular approach to everything in Judaism is everything has an explanation. Everything has to do with history, everything has to do with precedent, yeah? Chassidus comes along and says, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm going to show you that there's things about a Jew and there's things about Judaism which you cannot explain rationally. You know, Melly, listen to this. I was in a Khabar house a few years ago in Yudis Kislev, okay? And I told the story that I just told you about this African-American general putting on tefillin and crying. And after I told the story, I asked, must have been 150 people in the room, if anybody can explain rationally why this man cried. 2 women had explanations. 2. They came up with such convoluted ideas, but they had a way of scientifically explaining why it makes sense psychologically, emotionally, genetically. In other words, that it's not a neshama that this person cried. And to be frank, their arguments were incredibly irrational, but it was predicated on the need to be able to explain everything, because that's how they look at the world. Judaism, and Hasidus especially, looks at the world in a very different way. Inside every creation, there's a piece of God. Inside a Jew, there's a unique piece of God. And the piece of God which is inside a Jew gives a Jew a relationship with Hashem which you absolutely cannot explain rationally. And this is the basis for Mesidus Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. This is the basis for tshuva, and so forth and so on. So now here comes the question, Melly. One person's going to come along and say, really? If every Jew has an neshama, how come so many Jews are not religious? We can talk about that, and unfortunately there's a lot of good reasons why there has been such a terrible assimilation amongst Jews. Yeah, but I'm going to flip it the other way, and I'm going to ask a simple question. That Yidden went away from Yiddishkeit, you can explain based on social circumstances. That one Jew's soul should be awakened. And a Jew who is raised with no Yiddishkeit whatsoever should have a Yisoidus Tshuva, should be moved to become frum, to learn Torah, to do mitzvahs. That doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. When I was younger than you, when I was 16, I learned in Morristown. And I would go downstairs to the Bali Tshuva Yeshiva, speaking to Bachrim who were young kids, 19, 20, 21. They were very young. And I would ask them what brought them to Tshuva. And to be very, very honest, it's impossible to explain the energy of Tshuva, because the energy of Tshuva is a soul energy. It's so much bigger than the ego. It's so much bigger than the mind. It's so much bigger than the conscious person. This is the foundation of Hasidus. Do you follow what I'm saying? You understand what I'm saying? Right? Now, simple question. Can you accept this premise, or can you not accept this premise?
Could I accept it logically? No. Could I understand it? Yeah.
Factually. In other words, does it resonate with you? Do you say, yeah, I relate to that?
Of the feeling? What?
Of the reality, of the concept of a soul. That, in other words, when the Rebbe says that when you teach a little child alabes, it's not brainwashing, because you're giving him something that's already his. How did we start this conversation, right? When the Rebbe says, when you go on the street and you meet a Jew and you ask him to put on tefillin, you're not trying to change him, you're trying to give him what's already his. Do you understand the logical progression from that to this explanation? There is a basic belief in the Jewish soul. And the Jewish soul is the real motivation for being Jewish, certainly according to Hasidus. And that's what we're touching. What's the answer? Melly, can you hear me? So do you agree or disagree? I'm asking you a simple question.
It's the only way I could think of, possibly.
Say that again, please.
As for now, that's the only answer I know.
Okay, so now here's the point. Here comes $1 million statement, okay? Very important for people like you and me to hear. You don't have to be frei to have an neshama. You don't have to be facing certain death for your Yechidah to be revealed. A frum Jew in a frum community who lives a frum life also has an neshama. Meaning to say, even those of us whose lives have been so indoctrinated by Yiddishkeit, that's what we know, because that's how we were raised. There is a deep aspect to our being Jewish, which is above reason. Now, you may not see it. You certainly may not see it in the everyday. But if a Yid who has no Yiddishkeit in his background can have his neshama motivate him, a Yid whose entire life is Yiddishkeit can certainly have his neshama motivate him. I think you can agree with that. You don't have to put on the speaker. Just raise your thumb that you're getting what I'm saying. Right? You could be completely religious. You also have a neshama. So here's the deal, Melly. There's a simple point. There's a time of year that's a neshama time. That's the point. There's a certain time of year that's defined. The Jews are defined not by their mind and their heart, but by their soul. And that's narrowly the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, the Yamim Ne'erayim between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And according to Chassidus, broadly, it's the entire Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah until Simchas Torah. We say it's a neshama time. That means, if a whole year, the primary motivation and basis for a Jew's being Jewish in his behavioral life is his brain. Every day you get up in the morning and you put on film because your brain tells you to do it, because you understand it, because it feels right. And I guess you could say because it's your culture. You could say that also. Okay? But on a regular basis, your being Jewish is coming from your ego. It's not coming from your neshama. Chassidus makes an assertion that there's a time of year that we're all much more deeply in touch with our soul. What the Mittler Rebbe writes, it's brought in Hayom Yom, I believe. The Mittler Rebbe writes that during Aseres Yemei Tshuva, a Jew can suddenly start to cry and have no idea why. In other words, there is a specific time of year when we are much closer to our neshama than any other time. Now, this is something that's a lot more difficult to prove. You would have to, where do you see that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is a time that Jews are closer? So, the Ichad the Masman used to say, American Jews only go to Shul Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. According to Jewish law, going to Shul on Shabbos is much more important than going to Shul Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Or to say it differently, desecration of Shabbos is a bigger aved than desecration of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So why do American Jews focus on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and not focus on Shabbos? This is what Ichad the Masman said 85 years ago. The answer is because Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur talks to the soul more than Shabbos does. In other words, just like you get the basic idea that there is a component of Jewishness that's super rational, which you cannot explain based on the mind. It's a soulistic thing. I know there's no such word, but I've given myself permission to make up words a long time ago. The season of soul, the season of neshama, is the Yom Ne'erayim, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's a special time. It's when the Yid's neshama is aroused. In other words, even if there's no rationale to their being Jewish at all, and even there's no engagement to being Jewish, the neshama wakes up. A woman once said to me, she was married to 3 goyim in a row, a Jewish woman. She's a purist, only goyim, not one Jew in the mix. And she goes to Shul only Yom Kippur. She sits in the back. She talks to nobody. And she said to me once, I met her on America. She says, when I go to synagogue, I go to Khabar. Very, very far. I wouldn't call her secular. She was a very simple woman. I said, why? She says, because I believe religion, you're not supposed to mess with it. Let it be what it is. You don't want to go to Shul, don't go. When you go to Shul, do it right. The Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is a season of neshama. And again, this is hard to prove, but I believe that what I just told you was quite a meaningful proof that American Jews gravitate to Shul Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur more than any other time. And it's not logical. It's not something you can explain socially. It's because the neshama is being magnetically drawn to their Jewishness at this particular time, because it's a time of soul. That's what the Rebbe is saying here in this Maimer. The Rebbe is saying that there's a year. A year is 12 months, a lot of time. Most of that time, the primary motivation for a Jew's Jewishness is his consciousness. That means what he knows, what he understands, what he feels, what he senses, what he does. There is a season of neshama. That season of neshama is narrowly Aseres Yemei Tshuva and broadly Tishrei. Do you understand? So the point that the Rebbe makes in our Maimed is that just like in the calendar year, there is a season of soul, in the day there's a moment of soul. Every single day there is a neshama moment. Now, obviously it's at a much smaller scale. It's a microcosmic soul type. If you want to use the word experience, you can, even though, not everybody experiences neshama each day. The moment of neshama in the day, the highest moment of neshama in the day is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The evolution of that moment of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is Shemini Esrei. That's what the Rebbe taught us. That's what we learned yesterday. That when a Yid says Shema Yisrael, the neshama cries out. When a Yid says Shemini Esrei, the cry out of the neshama is manifesting. And he compares the second bracha of Shemini Esrei to Aseret B'Tshuma. He compares the third bracha of Shemini Esrei to Sukkot and Simchas Torah, and he prepares the last bracha of Shemini Esrei to Shmini Atzeres. Okay? So now, what did I just do, Melly? I taught you nothing. I like to say this. We went over yesterday's class. I simply said all the ideas I said yesterday, but I said them in a quite different way, and I think that the alternative way to say it reveals so much more of what the discussion is. Okay? If you're comfortable, we'll call it a class. Tomorrow's Tuesday, Wednesday. Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm not here. By the way, I was supposed to go with my children to Washington, and we went online and we discovered that Washington is all closed, so we're going to do some other thing. I just don't want to confuse people. Our next class will be Thursday, which is the fast day. We good? Okay, so listen, I want you to know that today's conversation, this is Chassidus. And I also want you to know that
it doesn't really answer to me why, for me, I don't feel the difference during that time.
Oh, right. The time part of it, the second part of it, the time part of it is more difficult to assert. I'm going to answer you very simply, Melech, because you don't make preparation. If in Elul there was a little bit, Elul's king in the field. King in the field means Hashem is available to you if you're interested in approaching him. If you're not interested in approaching him, no problem. The Yom Kippur is peasants in the palace. We're all with the Eibush in the palace on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I don't know you well, and I'm certainly not going to guess. Do you stand in Shul Ne'ilah and say, I really should be a better person, or do you say this is all boring to me? It's very conceivable that your experience of Aseret Mitzvah is, okay, I got to fast. Can't wait till the fast is over. I want to go get myself an eclair, whatever it is that I want to break my fast on. But I think that if people do even a minimal amount of preparation, you feel that there's a holiness about that time of year. It's different. It's not just different because we're doing different things. There's a special energy that is strengthened, that's made personal, it's made more acute if we meditate, even a little bit. Just pay a little attention to the time. Rosh Hashanah is coming, we got to do tshuva. And doing tshuva, by the way, doesn't mean hating myself. Doing tshuva means paying more attention to my religious self and undertaking to be better, practically, even in little things. But it's the attentiveness. It's the, I'm Jewish. Jewishness is important, and here I'm going to express it. I think even a little bit of thought would make it incredibly more meaningful. But I get your point. I understand. I understand. In other words, because I said two things. I said, number one, neshama, which is pretty easy to argue. And number two, neshama season. That's much more difficult to argue. And I'm not going to debate that this is precarious. I'm going to agree with you. I told you when I started that when I'm done, I'm not going to have proven anything to you. I will simply have explained it to you. And I think I did. Okay, well, I see you Thursday.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming. It means the world to me. Okay.